Welcome back to the news today. This is one-on-one. In every election campaign, behind the ads, the campaigns, and the database or debates, there are a group of people looking at the data, evaluating the results, and calling the winners and losers. With me tonight is someone highly familiar with that and everything that goes into it. Mr. Arnon Mishkin, heads of the decision desk at Fox News. Good evening. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
So, Mr. Mishkin, let's, a lot of people trying to predict and be maybe some kind of prophets before each and every campaign. Can you be a prophet?
There's money in it.
I know there's money in it, but can you actually be a prophet? Can you actually know, let's say 2 weeks before, 1 month before, 1 week before, who is going to win?
That depends on the election. In a general election in the United States, heading into November, it is often very possible 2 weeks out to know who's going to win. The reason for that is because in an American election, in a general election, you have a Republican versus a Democrat.
Yes.
And I can tell you how 85% of Americans are going to vote in 2016. Whether or not 85% of them. Whether or not 85% of them they will definitely be voting. 85% will either be voting Republican or Democratic, and we know today, you can ask them today how they're going to vote, and they'll tell you. The remaining 15% of the electorate may switch one place or the other. And some people would say it's only 5% that may switch. And those are the people that are really hard to predict. And that's what makes a general election in the United States somewhat easier than others to predict the outcome of.
So today when we are seeing an article that shows that Hillary Clinton is highly popular in the United States and maybe one of the most popular women in the United States, this can help her? Or if you're saying that 80% already know what they're going to vote, it's not going to help? Well,
Hillary Clinton has two hurdles. The first is to get the nomination, the Democratic nomination, and the second is to become the president. I guess the first is to decide whether or not or announce that she's going to run. We assume she's going to run. In terms of the first hurdle, getting the nomination, the fact that she is doing so well in the polls is only helpful to her, and that's because what she is basically doing is sewing up all the financial supporters, all the sort of semi-supporters who will say, I really have to be with her, and she is sort of making it impossible for someone else to really raise money. That said, I do think there's a likelihood that someone from the left will run against her for the nomination. I suspect that person will cause her some damage during the campaign, but I don't think they're going to be victorious. I think they'll just make the campaign go longer than it's supposed to go.
So if you...
Go ahead.
So let me ask you to be a prophet. And do you think in 2016 the Democrats or the Republicans will win?
I can tell you that I think at this stage that unlike the outcome of the last off-year election, the election just last November, I suspect the Democrats will be very strong in November 2016. That said, I don't imagine that in the best case scenario they'll get more, that the Democratic candidate could possibly get more than 53% of the vote, which means it's very possible for a Republican to win. It's very dependent on a number of issues, how sick people are of Democratic campaigns, how sick people are the Democrats, because they've had 8 years of Obama.
And how well Barack Obama will do in his last 2 years.
Right. And what will happen with Russia, what will happen with the Arab world, et cetera.
And ISIS and Syria, et cetera, et cetera. So let me bring you back to Israel, because we are here in the Jaffa Port. Okay. We're all excited about the elections that we have each and every 2 years. So
you have them more frequently than we do.
Yeah, which makes our lives much more interesting than the United States. So let's try to think about, with a lot of parties, with this system that we have the Labour and we have the Likud, but we have a lot of small parties. And some of the critics here in Israel might say that this system doesn't work because this what makes the unstable, let's say, governing system that we have in Israel, and we should go and maybe re-educate the society to start voting to two major parties. How do you see it?
From the perspective of a poller,
okay.
If you have two major parties, the job of the poller becomes much easier.
Of course.
And what that means is, from the perspective of your upcoming campaign, is that it is very hard for a poll to accurately predict how all these different minor parties are going to wind up doing. Moreover, I think one of the things that's happened in Israel over the past few years is that both sides, all the different parties have sort of lost their core base. Where they're in the United States, the Republicans have a very clear base, the Democrats have a very clear base. In Israel, it's not clear that Likud still has the base it once had. It's not clear that Labor still has the base. It's clear that Labor doesn't have the base it once had. And so what that means is that the voters tend to be very fickle. They're moving around from one party to the left to the other. That doesn't mean they're going to move from Meretz to
Israel Beitenu.
Israel Beitenu, but it does mean that they could be very moving amongst the different leftist parties or to the center parties, and similarly from the right parties amongst all of them, as well as towards potentially the center parties.
You know, I will ask you something, and I will appreciate if you will be very honest with me, because you're looking at it from the American perspective, and you're watching. How interesting is the Israeli campaign to the international arena, to the Americans?
First,
you can't be honest and tell me you're not interested at all.
For whatever reason, Israeli politics is always fascinating to Americans.
Okay.
And for the number of calls I get on the night of an Israeli election saying, so what do you make of these polls? And what do you make of the exit polls, and are they accurate, and what does it mean? Is much greater than one would anticipate. And I think it has something to do with the fact that you are at the center of one of the major conflicts of the world, and have always been fascinating to Americans. But it is, and moreover, it's a really interesting election because you're facing with very clear issues. Very clear issues of war and peace, very clear issues of the economy, and how the different candidates address those issues. And I think that'll make it a very interesting campaign, even though I would say if you asked most Americans, they would tell you Netanyahu is going to win.
This campaign, and I'll ask you maybe from this foreign perspective that you have, this campaign and maybe these elections that we're facing right now, you can see one major thing happening. Everybody is going in the parliament, left or right or center, is going with the idea, we will accept anyone but the current candidate. We will accept anyone but Benjamin Netanyahu. Did you see this like in any other campaign or in any other place in the world where everybody's just pulling hands together against one prime minister?
In a multi-party system, I've not seen it before. But I have certainly seen it in primary elections, in statewide elections, in mayoral elections in New York City, where sort of everyone unites around getting rid of a beam, or everyone in the 1980 election in the United States, everyone sort of united, particularly in the Republican Party, let us find someone who can defeat Jimmy Carter. And on the Democratic side as well, there was a very large contingent, roughly 48% of the Democrats who didn't want Jimmy Carter to be reelected. So you've seen that before, but it's very clear right now, which doesn't necessarily mean Bibi loses. It just means that he has a lot of people who hate him.
To say the least. Let me just, before we're finishing, how hard is your job 2 years before, and how hard it is a week before?
2 years before, it's very easy, as long as no one's running a tape.
Okay.
A week before, it can be very hard, depending on the election. I would say in 2012, all the polls said Obama was going to win. At the same time, I myself and a lot of other people had a nagging suspicion. There's some dissatisfaction here, and could people act in a slightly different way? I think most of us, by the end, were totally convinced Obama was going to win. But I will tell you that heading into this election, the only thing I will predict is that however Netanyahu is doing in the polls, he won't do as well on Election Day. That he has for whatever reason, he has a heritage of polling better than he votes. On the other hand,
correct.
After Election Day, he has a heritage of being very effective in terms of forming a coalition. So what happens, I don't know.
You know, it's amazing. It's just like Shimon Peres. Who would think that these two, at the end of the day, will end up just like so similar to one to another? What we were saying about the pollers, that they're in Israel. It's for Israeli pollers, the election day is Yom Kippur, the fast day.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, the big fast day for that. So I believe that for the Americans, it's different. Thank you very much for coming to our studio.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for being here.
Okay.
We're going out for a small break. That's it for tonight. Have a great night.